Today's scripture is from John chapter 4, verses 19 through 26. The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where the people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." This is the good news for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
It's great to be here. My name is Michael Burch. I'm the executive director for The Crossing, a campus ministry at UW-Madison that has been around for some time and is sponsored by UCC, the United Methodists, and the American Baptists jointly. And they all three really participate in significant ways to make that ministry viable. So thank you for your support of The Crossing. I think there is a really important connection between congregations and campus ministries that can get missed, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But first I want to say this, because I just moved here from Berkeley, California about 5 months ago. This is my first time preaching in a church in the greater Madison area. And so sometimes it's helpful when an outsider comes in to remind you of what a wonderful place you have. Oh my gosh, this church is awesome. It is so cool, yes. And you come to it every Sunday. Well, maybe you miss a few Sundays, but you come to it frequently enough to where you get used to it. And so one of the first messages, maybe the most important thing I have to say, is continue to appreciate this wonderful gift that you have and that you helped create for yourselves. I know that there was a lot of work and history here. So, wow, this is a great place to be and a great place to look forward to be on Sunday mornings. So, what a wonderful place. Let me tell you a little bit about campus ministry before I jump into the message in John. Campus ministry today is very different from what it used to be even 20 years ago. It's always changing, as you might imagine. But some of the important things that will connect with my message is you won't be surprised. This group won't be surprised, I think, at virtually anything I have to say, but it'll be a nice reminder. One is that there are dozens and dozens of different religious traditions at a large university like UW-Madison. And especially because of the culture and history of UW-Madison, maybe even more so, maybe even greater religious pluralism and diversity there than at other Midwestern or Big Ten schools. Madison's a very diverse place. There are about 6,000 international students at UW-Madison. Let me say that, 6,000 international students at UW-Madison from over 100 countries. Just think one question with that fact: how much new and different religious traditions come to the campus, come to Madison, come to faith communities in Dane County through that. So it's not like, well, whatever's going on the campus at UW is happening at the campus and the congregation. No, there is a relationship there, and you are being impacted by this. It's true that Christian denominationalism is waning. You don't have as often students first identifying as a Lutheran or a Baptist or a UCC former member. That's not how they identify, even though the student may have very well come out of a really strong youth program in a specific denomination and came to the UW-Madison that way. It quickly unravels when they start meeting all of their friends and their backgrounds are so diverse. Worship, while important, and while an important part of almost every campus ministry that I'm already familiar with at UW-Madison, is not the center. It's not really what draws the students to their activities and affiliations with campus ministries on the whole. This is important. I'm not knocking worship. I'm only bringing to your attention that spirituality is defined very broadly on campuses and also in our congregations. It's defined broadly here, I'm sure. There is a very authentic comfortability among many students, not all students, but among many, if not most students, a very authentic comfortability with different religions. with no religious affiliation. I'm going to guess that the majority of campus ministries have students participating in very impactful ways who identify as agnostic or atheist. But they're still coming to the campus ministry for other things. So campus ministry is really its own animal and has changed and is changing rapidly. Let me add this one last point, because it's central to our ministry too, is that while worship maybe not be at center, what is for many students is advocacy. Getting involved in justice issues and activism and partnering with other kinds of organizations, churches included, to do advocacy work in meaningful ways, whether it's racial justice, immigration, labor, fair labor, all those things. You may think, well, that's not really a college thing. It is a college thing, actually. And there are organized student groups. There's almost 1,000 organized student groups at UW-Madison. There's over 60 or 70 just religious campus ministry groups at UW-Madison. So that gives you some sort of picture of when you wake up in the morning and come to campus ministry, it's something's new each time if you're looking for it. And let me bring that newness then back to the church at large and the message this morning, which is a little bit reflected in my stole that I want to show off, I guess. It's about 20 years old, and it has a message in itself, as you can see. Tried to capture most of religious traditions, but what this is, actually when it was first made and I first wore it, now it seems I need it to go to the floor because I need more symbols. And I even had added, for the scientist and the hippie, I had added those just to try to cover my bases. But now there's even more. That interfaith or multi-faith experience with religion is the norm for progressive religion. You know this. I'm about to tell you about yourselves more in a minute. But I'm not bringing you a new message this morning. The ecumenical movement that maybe we could push back to the early part of the 20th century, certainly by the 1950s, was somewhat short-lived because interfaith and multi-faith language quickly among progressive churches entered into the picture. And it was not enough and is not enough now for us to talk about good relationships between Baptists and Lutherans or Congregationalists and Methodists. Big whoop, right? The question now that we are faced with today is how we engage with religious traditions and people who think religiously very differently than we do. And in a way that we understand does not threaten us or pose any sort of threat to us, but truly offers only really good new things, new ways of thinking, new understandings of the divine, and new understandings of how people all struggle together to make sense of their spirituality in a complicated world. It only has gifts for us. And for those persons such as yourselves, I'm not assuming a lot, I know about you, this comes as welcome news. So the interfaith and multi-faith legacy is here to stay. But what I want to say more about it as I jump into the story in John is that it's not actually kind of how I used to think about interfaith too, that it's an evolutionary process. That, for a few hundred years ago, maybe 400 or 500 years ago, there was the language of religious toleration that entered very intentionally into religious dialogue by philosophers and the academic elites, if you will, to talk about what religious toleration would be and how it would serve communities. And in its infancy, religious toleration really was, the word is correctly chosen, we're just going to tolerate each other. Because it arose in an era where it was all-out bloody warfare, even just between Protestants and Catholics, never mind Muslims and Christians. So toleration was this important message at the time that was, look, we don't have to slaughter each other over this. We don't have to have wars that go on for decades and decades and decades over our differences in religion. So religious toleration had its very important purpose. But we're way beyond that, hopefully. And we are even beyond ecumenism. We're at a new place where we understand not only that this prevents violence, but this deepens our faith. It deepens our relationship with God. And you don't need to do anything different other than continue in your UCC traditions. That's not actually, I used to think that, but that's not even really the case. You don't need to become part Jewish, part Muslim, part Buddhist, part Christian to make it all work. You're welcome to, but that's not necessary. Interfaith and multi-faith mission is really about understanding. And more than the understanding part, it's the willingness to want to understand, the willingness to try to understand. I've come to realize as a campus minister and as a pastor in general that that's actually where it's at. If we can get to the place where Christianity is marked by a willingness to understand, to listen, in many ways, the rest will fall into place. That's the mentality that we're seeking. It's not evolutionary, as I was saying. It's actually a kind of revelation to people of faith that ebbs and flows. And here in John, we see a message of interfaith or multi-faith message coming from the Gospel of John. So it wasn't like this had to happen later in the modern period. There was already thinking at the time of Jesus that religion wasn't really as divided and rigidly separate as they thought. Unfortunately, for Judaism at the time, this way of thinking was broadened and deepened because of a tragedy, the destruction of the temple, which to this day was never rebuilt. And so the Gospel of John is writing significantly longer after Matthew, Mark, or Luke. All who scholars have the consensus that even Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written immediately after the temple was destroyed, which impacted the content of the Gospels tremendously. From beginning to end, all of the Gospels are impacted fundamentally by one tragic event, the destruction of the temple. It's everywhere in Jesus' teachings, if you're aware of it. But nowhere like it is in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is another 20 or 30 years later of people trying to adjust. A generation has passed, given how generations quickly passed at that era. A generation or two has passed when they're still dealing with the absence of a temple, the place where God lived, the only place where worship could happen as the conversation between the woman and Jesus was playing out. Gone. And so the message that was brought by John, using the life of Jesus, I'll put it that way, scholars are in stronger agreement that the overwhelming number of sayings in Gospel of John are from John, not Jesus. But that's okay. That's important that we have a text like that much later. And so what's happening is that Jesus is meeting this woman who's coming to him, and he performs a miracle here that's not really identified as a miracle. He kind of reads her background, and she concludes that he is the Messiah. He is the one sent from God, and there's a conversation about where to worship. And Jesus is shown to be dismissing the significance of Jerusalem. This is huge. It's not small. It would be impossible to have been said just decades before. He's not saying, well, one day the temple will be rebuilt and everyone will return to the temple in that glorious day. No, he's not saying that. The temple is gone, and worship will never be tied to a specific place again. This is revolutionary kind of language. But I want to make you aware, too, it's not just Jesus. So we have sayings and writings from Greek philosophers pre-Jesus that say a similar kind of thing. There was the religion in Egypt of Isis, which actually kind of paved the way for Christianity to spread the way it did because it was a religion that ended up being pan-Mediterranean, where Isis temples were built all over the Mediterranean, east and west, so that people could worship Isis, not just in Egypt, but anywhere. This is what happened with Jesus when the temple was destroyed. There was a push for decentralization of the faith, which sounds good and makes sense with a destroyed temple. But then we know the history too. The history took us right back to that place. Jerusalem, Rome, Mecca, if we talk about the Abrahamics, have centralized places of worship. In other words, religion always has, we know this, and I think always will, have that temptation or that opportunity to consolidate power because it's about God. I think that's the message here, that will always be with us. We won't grow out of it. We'll have to keep reminding ourselves that God is bigger than place. Right here, this is not even in my notes, as I mentioned this wonderful, it's really easy when you have a place you're so affectionate for and that you love so deeply to not identify it as a special place to meet God. And I'm certain that this very space is a special place for you to meet God. So imagine that in the temple context. Imagine how hard that is in general for people of faith to divorce the depth of their spirituality away from space, away from place. That the true worshipers of God will be those who worship in spirit and in truth. John wasn't having Jesus say so much about how to worship, but simply about where you don't have to worship. And then all of a sudden the doors are wide open for us to worship right next to our brothers and sisters who see God differently, who have different understandings of spirituality. We can close that physical space, as hard as it is. So the message that John brought to those who would follow Jesus 30 years or more after a temple was destroyed was not the rebuilding of the temple. It was a looking forward of understanding Jesus without sacred space. That's really heavy. That's actually heavy for us in 2023. But this so that's why I say this isn't a matter of evolution and we can kind of coast and expect for the interfaith, multi-faith thinking to open the way to justice and peace for us. It's something we have to remind ourselves of perpetually through history. So it appears. We had the information from the Gospel of John 2,000 years ago that one day they wouldn't worship in Jerusalem or on the mountain that they stood on, but they would only worship in spirit and in truth. And here we are 2,000 years later, still needing that message. Well, to wind it up, I can tell you that I have extra good news for you. And I'm not here to ask for more donation. This is really true about where you sit in your tradition in the Congregationalist tradition and in the development of the UCC denomination in the past 20 to 30 years on the subject of interfaith and multi-faith. I've taken some words from your website and from the UCC National Resources for Interfaith Ministry to share with you because it shows that you understand this. And I'm bringing it to your attention not just simply to say, oh, now that's great, let's go celebrate, but to remind you of how far you've come and the torch that you carry. Not all denominations are responding to the interfaith, multi-faith call the way the UCC denomination is. I'm not UCC, I'm American Baptist. I preach in a lot of different Protestant churches. The UCC tradition stands out distinct for your mission and your commitment to interfaith dialogue. We believe in God's continuing testament, so that hearing God's ancient story anew and afresh in our lives and the world today is important. We advocate for justice for all. Think as I'm reading the words, how much interfaith is important to all of this. Our congregation extends hospitality as signs of God's inclusive love. The church's mission is to change lives. Lives are changed through global experiences and friendship. How do you have a global experience without interacting with other religions? God calls the world into being and creates humankind in the divine image to be servants in the service of the whole human family. Your language itself is just constantly fits and calls out that interfaith sensitivity. All are made in the image of God, Genesis 1:27. When we meet a human being, no matter what her or his religion is, we are meeting a unique creation of the living God. This is in your UCC resources. The vision of a just world for all is an inclusive proposition for all people and includes our interreligious engagement. The affirmation of all religious faith and spiritual traditions acknowledges the familiar and the unfamiliar and leaves room for that which is not yet named. That's beautiful. I constantly find myself struggling and frustrated with an absence of the kind of language that I think I need and can't find it. It's a good thing sometimes. The United Church of Christ has long been theologically engaged with Muslims and Jews in interreligious dialogue, as well as in the common source of these faiths, the religions of the book. That's really important. That is really true, too, that the United Church of Christ has long been theologically engaged on this topic. And I can tell you that as a professor in religion, which I've also been for several decades, that universities on the whole were behind. There are countless now universities who, in the past 25 years, we'll say, offered their first class on Islam in their religion department. All sorts of classes on Christian history and Jewish history, nothing on Islam for countless universities. The majority of universities have taught their very first class, and now some of them have chaired positions and whole programs of studies because it was a glaring absence for academics. It was shameful. And the UCC tradition was on that boat before many of the universities. Don't forget that. So Middleton Community Church, the message this morning is both ancient and contemporary. That God meets us anywhere. And we know this intuitively almost. That God meets us anywhere and God can speak to us in almost any context, hence the wonderful, simple slogan that UCC has developed with God is still speaking is so true, and you can live by it. You can live by it. I want to add one last part that's important that might seem like a side note to the story in John, because the message here with this is that we can easily get sidetracked on things that are just either not true or not really that important when it comes to interfaith or interreligious dialogue. It's an important focus. But in John, one part of the story that I left until now was that the woman decides that Jesus is the Messiah because he's able to say to her, presumably not knowing her, never having met her, said, I know that you have 5 husbands. Right? Remember this part of the story. It's right before I know that you have 5 husbands, and the husband that you're living with is not your husband, or the man that you're living with is not your husband. Now, let me tell you the interpretation of that story, because yes, I'm here to renounce the interpretations of the past of that story, which is this woman is like sleeping around or shacked up with some man after having been through 5 husbands. This is almost impossible to have been the story. But this would be a really good way for people to latch onto the wrong thing in the story and misinterpret it and miss the entire message of interreligious dialogue. Focus on the bad woman. But I can tell you how she had 5 husbands. Knowing a lot about ancient history, truly, as a professor of ancient history in general. They're dead. They're dead. And yes, 5 husbands sounds like a lot. It's like, whoa, how would that have happened? Well, yes, the writer of the story is making it exceptional. 5, that's pretty exceptional that Jesus might know that. Even in the ancient period, this is a terrible, terrible tragedy. But the reason why it doesn't say 3 is because that would be like a lucky guess. Because death was at the door in the ancient world. When you factor in life expectancy, disease and accident, and warfare, many women had numerous husbands. Tragically. We know the New Testament emphasizes the churches are supposed to be caring for, especially who? Widows. This was an ongoing problem. So the message here in this text, and by the way, this miracle, this is common, this is John's thing, because John did it at the beginning of the story, the gospel too, where Jesus told Nathanael, I saw you sitting at the fig tree before Philip even called you. He's like, oh my gosh, he knows about my life. He must be the Messiah. That's all that was happening in this story with this woman who Jesus was saying, I know your tragedy. I know your loss, and I haven't even met you. This has nothing to do with sin or bad behavior, which also is never mentioned in the story. And so I add that little side note. It's like, where are we going with that? Don't get distracted. Don't get distracted with other kinds of things that might be false obstacles to interreligious dialogue. The door is wide open. The door is wide open, and to conclude in the words of Jesus, as John speaks them, he says, the hour is coming when you will not worship in Jerusalem or on this mountain, but you will worship in spirit and truth. And then he repeats that, and he says again, the hour is coming and is now here. And is now here. Middleton Community Church, the hour for deep, meaningful, sincere, committed, interreligious dialogue is now here, and you are ready for it. Amen.
Our first announcement is going to be delivered by Ralph Jackson with a presentation video afterwards, and then there'll be a couple of other announcements.
We are told that God's vision for every one of God's people is to live in the fullness of life. And yet, we live in a county, a state, a country, and a world in which this vision has not been fulfilled for many, especially for those whose voices cannot be heard. What can we do? MCC's Faith in Action team was formed many years ago so that their members' voices could be added in support of social justice for all. And our Faith in Action team members have continued to be active even in the past few years in spite of the limitations imposed by COVID, as has been documented in the annual report and as you'll see in the video. Now, with COVID restrictions significantly reduced, our Faith in Action team members believe that our congregation is ready to add its United Church of Christ member voice in support of better lives for those who cannot speak for themselves, as many other regional UCC congregations have already done in our area. The purpose of today's meeting is to issue a call to action to determine whether our Middleton Community United Church of Christ congregational members agree, and if so, to start the process to make that happen. So please, as many of you as can, join us in the educational wing shortly after church. We want to hear your voice as to where you think we stand and what we're ready to do. Thank you.
today, or I should say through Sunday, July 2nd, we are still accepting nominations online for offerings of a group or organization for receiving a surprising gift from Middleton Community Church. And so please put your suggestions in. There's a lot of groups and organizations that could use that help, and we won't know about them unless you let us know. Another announcement we have today is just a reminder about Neighbor Day, August 27th, kind of a save your date kind of postcard in the mail. If you're interested in joining in, again, there's volunteer projects. If you're interested in being part of making that happen, there'll be food trucks and fun, and just something to get to know our neighbors. And there won't be a service that day because we will have this going on instead. And as always, thank you to everyone online or in our donation boxes right outside the sanctuary here as far as any financial help, and also thank all of our volunteers for all the wonderful help, and that makes our organizations that we have here and our groups and committees and our worship today move forward and happen.
Receive the benediction. A time is coming, and now is here. So go from here with anticipation and optimism, not naively, but rooted deeply in your wisdom and insight. Be powerful allies with the trampled and impoverished, and labor together with liberating forces of peace and justice, inspired by the Spirit and called forward from within your own human heart. Amen.